All right, hello everybody. We are fully aware that we're the only presentation holding you back from the free lunch, which, by the way, is right outside our door, so we're in a prime spot if we can get you out of here in time. So I'm Catherine Sabella, and just briefly introduce Vanessa Voorhees and Marcia Ellison. And today we'll be presenting on vocational peer mentors and specifically the perspectives of early emerging adults with serious mental health conditions. And I will say that the pairing of these papers was very fortuitous for me, so we'll go through this. Oops. I don't want to mess this up. Okay, so just to acknowledge the Transitions Research and Training Center, which Marcia and I are directly from, and who funded this study. And again, Heather did a great job setting up why this population is important. I think most people in this room are aware of this, but there's a lot of them. There are varying estimates on the rates of them in this country due to the different ways that data is collected and the different definitions that are used. So I put up 5 million up there as an estimate. And we know that it's a unique developmental stage of life. Again, Heather did a great job setting that up. And psychosocial development is still ongoing, and these young adults with mental health conditions are really struggling to succeed in all aspects of life, especially in employment and educational attainment. We talk about developmentally appropriate tasks during this period of life, but young adults with mental health conditions are usually really struggling and getting set back, and that affects their lifelong career trajectories. And social capital in this group is often diminished. Social networks are limiting, and that's especially relevant to vulnerable subgroups. So there are high rates of involvement in multiple systems, whether not just child mental health, but juvenile justice, foster care, child welfare, and so the challenges are confounded for those subgroups. So if this was an adult mental health conference, I'd probably get things thrown at me for the title Promising Practices and then IPS under it. But as Chuck and Marianne were just discussing, while there's a huge evidence base for IPS and supported employment with older adults with mental illness, and it likely works for some young adults, we still don't have a really great idea or understanding of how it works and for which young adults it works for. And Chuck explained IPS, but there's an employment specialist working with a clinical team. And there has been some successful adaptations for the first episode psychosis population, which is typically young adults, and that use the addition of supported education, because we do know that a lot of young adults are simultaneously pursuing employment and education. And we have a feasibility paper that's, I don't know where that bullet came from. Anyways, so the use of peers is also really promising. I guess the feasibility paper is currently under review for the adaptation, I apologize. So the use of peers in the last decade has gotten a lot of momentum in the mental health world. And there's definite evidence base, pretty good evidence base among older adults, the use of peers with serious mental illness, and in other at-risk populations. And we know that natural mentoring is also building up evidence base. And in this age group, you would think peer influence is the highest, as we talked about. The kids are pulling away from their parents, and peers really are the ones with a lot of the influence. And we've seen that there is increasing need for role models in this age group, again, especially in those vulnerable populations. So what we did is, as part of the RTC, we decided to test the feasibility of an adapted IPS model. So we took supported employment, added supported education, and added the use of a near-age vocational peer mentor to the model. So that's what we do a lot of at the RTC. We adapt these evidence-based practices. This was a single group, mixed method, pre-post feasibility. It's a very small study. We're not going to get into details on the entire study today. We've presented on that previously, and we have some papers that have been submitted to describe that. I do want to take a moment, though, to highlight that this study took place in Chicago at the Threshold Young Adult Program, the YAP program. And it's worth mentioning because this is a very unique sample. The Threshold is the largest mental health service agency in Chicago. The Young Adult Program serves about 17 to 20-year-olds, and I think most of them, or almost all of them, come from the foster care system. And it is a residential program, a lot of community residential, so living in apartments in the community rather than behind locked doors. But these kids have really high rates of complex trauma history. Again, they've aged throughout the foster care system. So again, they're really I would identify them as the vulnerable subgroup that I mentioned before. So today, like I said, we're really going to focus on describing the vocational peer mentor piece of the study, exploring the relational processes that work in that relationship, and then identifying valued characteristics so we're slowly starting to build the evidence on what would this near-age peer mentoring look like. In this study, the peer qualifications, the definition of peer varies all over the place depending on what you're looking at. So they needed to be self-identified as having a serious mental health condition, experience in the YAP program at Thresholds. We then later expanded that to at least experience in other service systems. And because these are vocational peer mentors, it was important that they were high school graduates with some employment or post-secondary education experience. And the peer mentors came on board and they received great training from Vanessa and the team at Thresholds, about 40 hours of training to just make sure that they were knowledgeable what IPS was, what the employment specialists do, learn how to share their story, and build those active listening skills that are really important. So again, how are these defined? The really important thing we learned in implementation was that vocational peer mentors needed to work really closely with the education and employment specialists and be seen as a part of the team, not just from the participant perspective, but from the employment specialist perspective. Who are these peers? Why are they working with my team? What's going on? And their role, again, was to provide emotional support, validation. It's all about engaging them, helping them engage in services, understanding what the employment specialist is working with them on so that they can kind of coach them appropriately, support, and then that role modeling that we talk about teaching, even things on professionalism and what to wear and how to communicate. Throughout the study, there were about 1 to 6 mentees assigned per mentor, and their services were delivered in weekly meetings in the community, which proved really important. So again, today we're really just honing in on the satisfaction data that we have on the peer mentors from this study. So it was mostly open-ended, kind of semi-structured satisfaction survey, likes, dislikes, what did you like about your peer mentor, what did you value about your peer mentor, and also how did the peer mentors help you, a little bit of impact. Our goal here was, again, to test the feasibility of this model, not necessarily to test how this model improved outcomes. We're not there yet. The data was coded. We had 3 independent coders who went through the open-ended surveys independently and met together as a team. And in the end, we had 2 cohorts identified or categorized. Those who had a mostly positive peer mentor experience, they were satisfied, they liked it, and those who had either negative, mixed, or no opinion on the peer mentor experience. And we also have data from the Working Alliance inventory, which most of you might be familiar with. It measures the working alliance between a client and their therapist typically, so we adapted that and used the word peer mentor instead. And again, briefly, just where's this data coming from? The study was small, 35 participants, and we only had 22 participants with satisfaction data. Again, these were participants ranging from ages 17 to 20. They were mostly female, mostly African American. Only 2 of them were high school graduates or GED, and 13 had some previous employment history. Mood disorders was the primary diagnosis. I will remind you again, I think the entire sample had a complex trauma history too, or some kind of trauma history. So that's the setup, and then I'm going to turn over to Vanessa, who's going to really get into what you guys really want to know about.
Okay. Hi. My name is Vanessa, and I worked on the implementation side of this. But I'm going to present the findings and then kind of launch us into a discussion. I work for Thresholds Research Center as my role. So I'm going to just touch on the peer mentor demographics. I'm going to mention some of the valued peer mentor characteristics. Also going to talk about the experiences of that relationship and those interactions in the community between the mentee and mentor. I want to touch on also the overall perceived benefit that young people thought. Did I get something out of meeting with my vocational peer mentor? And finally, how did the Working Alliance stuff play out with this positive group versus this negative, mixed, and no opinion about one's peer mentor? So here's some basic information about the peer mentors who participated in the 2.5 years of the implementation study. What I'd like to highlight, there were 13 over the 2.5 years. One issue with this was high peer mentor turnover. It was a tough job. I supervised these young people. It was hard to keep them in the position. age range 20 to 30 years old. We ended up towards the end of the implementation period hiring older youth, 27, 28, 29. They stayed employed longer. They also were further in their vocational development. Also, look at this, 10 out of 13 peer mentors used supplemental security income. So they were able to balance that work and school engagement while getting SSI, which we've heard in Chuck's presentation. And also, just again to highlight the uniqueness of this population having a child welfare history, 9 out of 13 had aged out of child welfare at age 21 in Illinois. So what did young people say were the value peer mentor characteristics? And these are the themes that we drew from their actual quotes of these beautiful open-ended surveys. Many young people said things like, I like my peer mentor because they're strong and positive, they're honest and trustworthy. Trust appeared throughout these open-ended surveys many, many times. They also have similar life experiences and a capacity to empathize. I think this is really important given the uniqueness of a population with a complex trauma history. And finally, many young people identified that they had to have overcome some struggle that the young person could relate to. They were able to share their story of overcoming it. So in the young people's own words, I'd like to show you some quotes that illuminate some of those themes I just mentioned. One, when I asked, or I did not ask this, sorry, in the survey, young people were asked, what do you like about your peer mentor? My peer mentor is trustworthy. I can talk to him about everything. Talk comes up a lot, and these young people are in lots of services like therapy and group therapy, and yet talking to this person had more meaning than just maybe talking to someone else. Also asked, what did you like about your peer mentor? She didn't look at me differently. She didn't put on a phony act. And this speaks to authenticity, being real. And then, what did you like about meeting with your peer mentor? Someone who was one of us. They can talk about their life, and this talk piece, how they get through it, and then show us how to do it. And I think that this is really interesting. This talking is part of it, but that they're one of us, that we really get more out of. And that is, I think, unique to this peer piece. Also, what was asked as part of this survey is to rate how much you agreed or disagreed with certain peer mentor characteristics that would make a good peer mentor. And so, let me just highlight this one right here. Being a graduate of the Young Adult Program at Thresholds, 14 either strongly agreed or agreed that they thought their peer mentor, to be a good peer mentor, should have been a YAP graduate. So having gone through that experience of YAP was very meaningful. Interestingly, 16 strongly disagreed that their peer mentor should have a serious mental health condition. But in order to have been a YAP graduate, you had to meet for Access 1 disorder. So it's interesting, and that could speak to the developmental age of these young people and where they're at in their own recovery and acceptance of having a mental illness or their own discovery of having a mental health condition. And also, I wanted to point out, having work or school experience, very highly valued. 16 strongly agreed they wanted a peer mentor that was working or going to school, which makes sense. It's a vocational peer mentor, young people are in vocational services. So what I'm personally very interested in is what happens in these relationships, these interactions, and how those become meaningful for the experience of working with peer mentors. So when asked, what did you like, or what was it like meeting with your peer mentor in the community? What did you like about it? What did you dislike? Here were some themes that my mentor gave me advice. So there's an exchange of advice, but it's coming from someone with lived experience giving advice, which will be important in a moment. Feeling related to and understood. Having, again, this opportunity to talk and be heard, that the peer mentor provides this experience. But it's beyond just meeting and figuring out a task to get a job or go to school. That something's happening, that a relationship is forming, and that means something. And finally, there's this thing that happens that meeting with your peer mentor equates to trust and safety that is very important and emphasized throughout all of these surveys. So here's in their own words. When asked, what do you like about meeting with your peer mentor? My peer mentor understands where I'm coming from, and I understand where she is coming from. And this is very different than relationships where you have a mental health provider helping someone. This young person is recognizing, I get her, not just I feel understood. And I think that's unique and important to know in these relationships. Again, with complex trauma histories, feeling safe and listened to, very meaningful, about the actual exchange, not just that the peer mentor is trustworthy. I feel that trust is be the word, it's constructed within these relationships. And finally, we talked about my job, and how important it was that I keep it, but it was also a bond. And so these young people recognize that over the year of interacting with their peer mentor, that they're building a meaningful relationship. Okay, so did they think they benefited from their peer mentor? We're directly asked. 16 cited benefits out of the 22 we have data for. What they thought they benefited from was vocational go achievement, enrolling in school, getting jobs. They felt that they knew what they wanted to do more, and that they had more agency in doing so. They knew how to do things now, by after meeting with their peer mentor. They also got direct support around job search and interview support, which is technically the role of the vocational specialist, right? But the peer mentor is there and doing different things and coaching around interviews. And also having, this is a goal of the peer mentors, that the peer mentors would help young people engage in their services more. And the young people did mention this. I engaged more with my vocational worker because of my peer mentor. It wasn't everyone, but it was a few. Now, here's their perceptions. So 13, as you can see, well, 13 overall had 100% everything they had to say about peer mentoring was positive. However, 2 had very mixed feelings, said really great things about peer mentoring, but then had some concerns about it. Concerns were around, I never could find a time to meet with my peer mentor, our schedules wouldn't work, that my peer mentor talked too much about her own problems or his own problems, not enough about me. And then there were some negative clubs that I just mentioned. And then 4 really didn't have an opinion about peer mentors. And why that was is because they barely met with their peer mentor 1 or 2 times. So they said, I don't really have an opinion. So here's the working alliance piece. The working alliance, the strength, and what we'd hope to see is if you had a positive peer mentoring experience, that your working alliance with your peer mentor would be higher. And there's a significant difference. It's a very small sample, I do know this. But if you had a negative, mixed, or no opinion about your peer mentor, you did have a lower score on the working alliance inventory, suggesting that these young people did form relationships. Okay, but here's the piece. Did young people, we can't make a direct, we can't say this is a direct relationship, did young people get jobs and go to school when working with their peer mentors? And we see out of the 13, 9 did enroll in school or start a job. However, 7 out of the 8 that had mixed, negative, or no experiences started school or started a job. So how do we make sense of this? So in fact, the young people who had negative, mixed, or no opinion often had a very strong working relationship with their vocational specialist. And so that they didn't engage with both. Be 2 more workers on top of their therapist and case manager and residential staff and all these other people. And so I think that's one way to make sense of it, but also very interesting given primarily very positive experiences with these peer mentors. Okay, so just a quick discussion piece. Yes, find a mentor. Value and benefit, many did find much or a lot of value in meeting with a peer mentor around vocational development. Many did perceive a benefit, but we're not seeing the direct getting a job or going to school necessarily from this, but that it's providing some other additional service as part of the vocational services. What I just mentioned about the vocational specialist relationship, future studies should take this into mind and try to understand what happens and why young people might really need to work with a peer mentor. It may be because they're earlier in their own vocational development and they're just trying to figure things out versus maybe some people that are ready to get that job are really going to bond with that vocational specialist right away. And also just to note, this population with the young people in the study had very delayed vocational development. Nearly all of them, it was the first time that they were starting post-secondary or engaging in work, and they were 19 and 20 years old. Also, just quickly, in trying to find any mentoring literature, especially peer mentoring literature, there's not much out there. And what I really wanted to find was someone who was doing work on what happens in these relationships. And I came across Renee Spencer's work at BU, who studies adult and adolescent mentoring relationships. And what she has found in her qualitative work is that mentoring is made up of these 4 primary components: companionship, empathy, collaboration, and authenticity. And all 4 of these, I would say, constructs were represented by young people's survey responses. But what I think is missing from Renee's work, and I think we need to do, and I hope in the future to do more research on, is this idea of trust, and how trust is playing out, how trust is achieved by these things. And I think trust is part of all of them. And finally, we need to really think about what is peer. What does that mean? What does it have to be a near age person? Could it be someone older? How do we define that? The idea being if we have something to relate with one another, that we will then be moving further on vocational development and mental health recovery. Shared life experiences vary. We need to understand what these are. In this particular study, being a YAP graduate was more meaningful than having a serious mental health condition. We need to understand that. But the potential for addressing stigma and vocational development among this population is so huge. I think we just need to really be aware of that. And I'm excited for future work in this area. Marcia is going to talk about practice implications very quickly.
Actually, I'm actually going to start with a metaphor, which probably will say more than any of these words on the slides. So this is not coming from me. This is coming from a mature adult with lived experience talking about having peer support. And he said, so I'm deep in a hole and I can't get out. And along comes a psychiatrist and he looks at me and he feels sorry and he writes a medication prescription. He throws it down in the hole for me. And I'm still in the hole and I'm asking for help, and along comes a social worker. And a social worker feels sorry for me and she puts her hand in and tries to grab me and pull me out of the hole. And I'm still in the hole and I'm calling for help, and along comes another person with lived experience, and they jump in the hole with me and say, hey, I've been here. I know how to get out, and I'm going to show you the way. So the little metaphor about peer support and peer mentorship that I think would be helpful. In the case of the program at YAP and Thresholds, we did see high rates of turnover. There were a lot of different things that Thresholds did to try to address the turnover. And as Vanessa said, some of that had to do with going to broadening the experience, looking for peers that were in the community rather than strictly graduates of Thresholds. They were a little bit older, they were further in their own vocational recovery, and that helped. So we broadened the criteria for hiring, and we went for near age rather than same age mentors. Also, there's greater clarification of the role. We have a feasibility paper hopefully coming out that describes how we needed to, the peers were really like, what am I supposed to be doing with this person? And when there was this uncertainty on the peers' part, the mentees were not all that satisfied either. So when we were able to make it very clear that the mentors should be working closely with the vocational specialists and have a mutually defined set of goals for the individual, with the individual, that actually helped the turnover and satisfaction. So let's see if I know how to do this. Okay, so practice implications. Training needs were, we did create a manual. We were training the peer mentors not only how to be a peer mentor, but also how to be an employee at Thresholds. So there was a lot of vocational training that went in for the peer mentors themselves. So keep that in mind. As I mentioned, the connection with the vocational team was very important, and to literally get everybody on the same page. So they began to attend the same meetings as the vocational specialist. That helped the specialists feel better about the mentor and the mentor with the team, and it all promoted a little bit of harmony there. The peer mentors did need clinical support anyway, and aside from being an employee and a member of the vocational team, Vanessa was the clinical support provider. We have found at the RTC that hiring people with mental health conditions requires some support above and beyond their own supervision, that's a need, that will help. We discovered that the mentees were meeting in the community, and the mentors, in that case, needed to have cars and computers and phones, just like vocational specialists and everybody else that's providing services in the community. So it's a resource implication to keep in mind. Incentives for mentee meetings. After a while, we gave the mentors $5 in Dunkin' Donuts gift cards to meet with the mentees, and so that they can all have some coffee and donuts together. And that is a material support, and it made a difference. So let's not disregard the importance of having a little bit of refreshment like we're all looking forward to in a minute. Last, just a mention about funding. So you may all be thinking about how the heck am I going to fund for peer mentors? I can barely fund all my other clinical staff. Medicaid does provide reimbursement for peer specialists. It's a reimbursable service in some states and increasingly in more states, and it can be brought into a Medicaid waiver. So if you're thinking about finances, keep that in mind for your state. All right, so that's all I've got, and please, what have we got? A few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Vanessa, can you talk a bit about why this was so difficult for the peer mentors as a position?
Can you hear me? Yeah, so 2 reasons. One, mental health and returning to a program where you were triggered because of what had happened in that program for your own recovery. 2, dealing with relationships. So boundary issues came up a lot with these young people and their mentees, and not necessarily their mentees, but their mentees' friends within the program. And so we had to create a hard and fast rule: you're not allowed to hang out with these young people outside of the program. And I did not want to do that. I wanted a sense of community fostered among these young people for support beyond the program. But unfortunately, because of things happening outside of the program, off hours, where there was relationships, romantic relationships, and power dynamics playing out. And so some people were let go because of that as peer mentors, after we had, of course, clarified this is a hard and fast rule. We did give 3 warnings and let people know. Lots of coaching around boundaries. Boundaries with staff and boundaries with young people was what I spent almost all supervision doing.
That boundaries with staff. Want to talk about that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So in this particular program where this adaptive vocational services were implemented, they didn't quite know what to do with the peer mentors. Not only did the vocational team not know what to do with them, but it's housed within a program where there's case management and psychiatry and many therapists. Even a school is in the program with a principal, and no one quite knew how to treat the peer mentors. No one knew how much information you could share with them. It was like, are they an employee, or can they know that this person just tried to hurt themselves last night? Like, there was all these questions around how much should they know. And no matter how much I advocated, there was the powers that be. It was just how things were done, and there was a lot of, it took 2.5 years for even the young people to get keys for the building of peer mentors, because it was like, oh, a peer mentor can't. And I, of course, created a contract that the peer mentors would sign, understanding you can't go into anyone's office, you only can go into the vocational office. But there's things like that peer mentors have little power. You have to think about those things when you're developing a program like this.
Everybody's hungry.
Yeah, enjoy lunch. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming.